Some TV advertisers have less than 15 seconds to get their message across to you. Yet the opening of any commercial is very carefully crafted to get your attention and make you want to watch it. That same brief commercial message usually ends with some kind of summary or an appeal. Maybe it's a phone number or an address for you to purchase whatever's being sold. The person who designs those messages knows something that you should know too. The introduction and a conclusion of a message are vital to achieving whatever your communications goal is. Now, while the introduction and conclusion only make up an overall 20% of your overall speech, the introduction and conclusion provides audiences with important first and final impressions of both you and your message. So let's take a look first at the purposes of introductions. Within a few seconds after you meet somebody, you form a pretty strong first initial impression of that person. And that initial impression is usually fairly long lasting. Well, the same thing happens when you start your speech. From the very beginning, we start to formulate ideas about whether we like you, like your topic, agree and disagree. All those happen from the very beginning of the speech. So as a speaker, it's your task to ensure that your message that you send in your introduction basically gets us to listen to you. Now, specifically, a good introduction serves 5 important functions. So let's take a look at the 5 important functions of an effective introduction. First, a key purpose of your introduction is to gain the favorable attention of your audience. Now, why do we emphasize favorable? Well, it's actually possible to get the attention of your audience, but in doing so, you either alienate them or disgust them to the point where they become irritated rather than interested in what you have to say. This was about a student giving a speech on donating blood. So at the beginning of his speech, he started off by savagely slashing at his wrist in front of a stunned audience. Blood spurting, audience members screamed. It was real blood, but not his. What he had done is he had created little devices with little pouches under his arms, run tubes down his sleeves, and so that when he made the action of acting like he was cutting his wrist, he was able to squeeze the little pouches and squirt blood out as though he had, well, cut his own wrist. Okay, so you can imagine that he certainly grabbed the attention of his audience, but the shock and disgust of seeing such a display pretty much made it impossible for the audience to pay attention to anything else he said in that speech. So by all means, be creative in your attention-getting devices, but also use a little bit of common sense. Now, perhaps the most obvious purpose of an introduction is to introduce the subject of your speech. Within a few seconds after you start your speech, we should have some idea, in general at least, of what you plan to talk about. Now, the best way to ensure that your introduction does in fact introduce your topic is making sure that you've written a well-worded central idea, that one-sentence summary of what the speech is about, and you state it out loud as part of the preview statement of your introduction. Now, once you've captured our attention, you've introduced your topic, you now have to give us a reason to listen. So listening motivation is the next purpose of an effective introduction. We find that an unmotivated audience, they tune out pretty quickly. They find other things to think about and do. You can help establish this listening motivation by basically showing your audience how your topic affects them. Your audience is going to say, what's in it for me? We're kind of selfish, so we want to know, why should I invest the next 5 to 7 minutes, 6 to 8 minutes, ever how long the speech is, in listening to you. Now, one thing that we can use in the introduction that may help establish this motivation is through the use of something we call proximity. Now, when you think about something being close proximity to something else, that means it's near it, right? So when we use proximity in the introduction, we want to say things that the audience can relate to. For example, let's say that you are doing a speech about seatbelt usage, and you've got access to all kinds of statistical data. You've got a national study, you've got one study done by the California Highway Patrol, but then you've also got a study from the county that you live in. Well, utilizing that statistical data from that county you live in, it has closer proximity to your audience rather than a national study because they're a part of it. So they see themselves within that data, and that shows them why it's related or relatable to them. just have us saying, this concerns me, this is important to me. That's what you have to do. Next, your introduction should help establish your credibility. Now, credibility is that attitude we have towards you as an audience member. Has everything to do with whether we trust you and believe you. And so we will believe somebody who we believe to be honest, who we believe that knows what they're talking about. So you have to do things in your introduction to show you're knowledgeable, experienced, informed in whatever it is you're talking about. So, the final purpose of an effective introduction is to preview the main ideas of your speech. So remember our little phrase, tell them what you're going to tell them, then tell them what you told them. We want to tell them what we're going to tell them as a part of this introduction. So we have this preview statement that includes a stating of the central idea and a very specific stating of the main points that you're going to talk about. So, what makes effective introductions? Well, just about any type of support material that you could use to support your speech can work well in an introduction. So that would be a story or an illustration. As we said, an illustration almost always guarantees audience attention. Could be a startling fact or statistic, a quote from some expert in the field, but there's some other things that we can use outside of that as well. For example, questions can be used effectively in an introduction. And basically, as you ask a question and you pose it to your audience, you're doing so so that we anticipate the answer coming somewhere during the speech, and so therefore we listen more carefully because we want to find out the answer to your question. Maybe we make a reference to some historical event. So what person's not familiar with the opening lines of Lincoln's Gettysburg Address? 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. So as Lincoln stands on the battlefield in Gettysburg, dedicating the new national cemetery, he starts the most famous speech in American history with a reference back to the Revolutionary War. A personal reference can make good use in your introduction where you cite your own personal experience. It helps build your credibility and shows that you know what you're talking about. Maybe instead of referring to an historical event or a recent event, maybe you refer to the event at hand. You actually reference the event for which the speech is being given. And so in that sense, we talk about the dedication ceremony, the wedding, the rehearsal, whatever's taking place. You reference that actual event. And then, like it or not, with as many speeches as are given out there, there's a chance that you can make a reference to a previous speech. If you have a speaker before you, you reference something they said in their speech and you bring it into your speech. Now let's transition and talk about conclusions just a little bit. Where your introduction creates an important first impression, your conclusion creates an equally important lasting impression. Your audience is long going to remember the effect of your speech over exactly what you talked about. So, an effective conclusion has 4 main functions. First, your conclusion should summarize the speech. So, really, this is the tell them what you told them part of our little phrase, and conclusions fill this part of that phrase. So this is your last chance to repeat your main ideas for your audience. Usually this is done as either the beginning of the conclusion or sometimes it's the transition into the conclusion where we start to summarize the things that we talked about. So basically the summary is to your conclusion what the preview statement is to your introduction. Another purpose of your conclusion is to restate the main idea in some memorable way. The conclusions of a number of famous speeches that we have are among some of the most memorable statements we have. Let's take General Douglas MacArthur, his farewell speech to the nation at the end of his career when he concluded with these memorable words. Old soldiers never die, they just fade away. And like the old soldier of that ballad, I now close my military career and just fade away. An old soldier who tried to do his duty as God gave him the light to see that duty. Goodbye. So the end of your speech is your last chance to impress the central idea upon your audience. Do it in such a way that we can't help but to remember it. Another necessary component of an effective conclusion is motivation to respond in some way. And so, yes, even if your general purpose is to inform, you want some kind of response from us. You don't want us just sitting there numb and stoic and unresponsive. You want us to become interested in your topic. Maybe we try it out for ourselves if you talk about a hobby. And then clear it with a persuasive speech. That motivation to respond can be much stronger, where you have some kind of direct appeal to action, where you're asking us to do something like buy a product, support a cause, write your congressman, vote for a candidate. Lastly, your conclusion should provide closure. So this is probably the most obvious purpose of a conclusion. Speeches have to sound finished. So by the words you use and by what you say, we know that when you say your last word, the speech has come to an end and that it's over. So, what makes effective conclusions? Pretty much anything that we just talked about that made good introductions can be used to make effective conclusions as well. But here's a few other things that we can add to this. Maybe we issue an inspirational appeal or a challenge. Clearly, if you watch Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech, the entire speech builds to a crescendo where he issues this challenge to the country there at the end. Maybe you finish a story or answer a question, so you kind of tie the end to the beginning. You kind of go back to something you said in the introduction. And then, of course, obviously, in persuasive speeches, we may have a direct appeal to action. This is where you directly ask your audience to sign that petition, join the club, donate money, volunteer time. We actually ask them to do something at the end of the speech. So, where your introduction and conclusion make up very small parts of your speech, no more than about 20%, they are vitally important to achieving whatever your communication goal may be.